Biologists not only study the weather patterns and the abiotic forces that shape the environment and the particular temperature and precipitation levels there, they also study how energy and nutrients flow and cycle within a particular environment. Now, this is where we really see the interaction between abiotic and biotic forces. So the foundation of any ecosystem is going to be the producers. These are the plants and the bacteria and other organisms that can take non-living or abiotic chemicals and convert them into something that is usable for the rest of the community around them. So how well those producers can actually harness sunlight energy and take in other chemicals is going to affect the productivity and the biodiversity in the rest of the community. So sunlight is the ultimate source of all energy on Earth. But that energy is heat energy. And that heat energy is completely useless for living things. If we can't harness that heat energy and turn it into something that is usable by other levels of the system, it's going to be completely useless. So plants, photosynthetic organisms, are vitally important as the foundation for all of our energy production and therefore the foundation for the entire ecosystem. So plants absorb sunlight energy and they convert that light energy into basically food or chemical energy. So I said heat a minute ago. Heat is really important, but what they're actually doing is taking in the light energy, not the heat energy. And we'll talk about heat in just a minute. Now, the important thing here is that any of the energy that is going to be consumed by other levels within our ecosystem has to first be taken in by the plants. Now, this is a process called photosynthesis, and in photosynthesis, photons of light are used to power the production of sugar molecules. And that's a very oversimplified way to state that process. But basically, sunlight energy comes in, it's converted into simple sugars, and then that plant uses those simple sugars as either their own chemical energy source, or it is converted into the structural parts of the plant. The cell walls and the roots and things like that. Once those producers harvest and convert that light energy, it's now available for the other levels in our system. So the first level is the producer level. After that comes the consumers, the individuals that eat plants and eat other organisms. So our primary consumers, they're the first level above our producers, and we call them the first level above our producers because they are the ones that are directly eating the plant life. So herbivores are organisms that eat only plants. Plants are their only source of energy and nutrients. And these are things like some rodents, some ungulates, deer, cows, things like that. These guys are the first level of taking in the energy from the plants. Now, not all of the energy that comes from the sun and is incorporated into producers are going to be passed to the next level. Some of that energy is turned into structural components of the plants that might never be eaten. During the process of this conversion of light energy into into food energy, some of that energy is lost as heat. Some energy is lost between the producers and the consumers as heat when the, let's say this rodent here, converts that food into into growth. Bones and muscles and things like that. When that food is converted, some of the energy is lost in the chemical reaction that is the breakdown of the plants and the incorporation of that energy into that animal. So not all of the energy that is taken in by the primary consumers can actually be passed on to the next level. The next level are the secondary consumers. Now these are the guys that eat the plants. These are the carnivores. So these are the animals whose main or sole source of energy is other animals. So they are not eating plants, they are eating other animals. Now again, not all of the energy that was in this rodent is being passed to this snake, and not all the energy that's in this snake is going to be passed to this hawk. At the very top of our food chain are going to be the tertiary consumers. These are the top carnivores. These are the carnivores that nobody else eats. So they are eating anything below them, and nothing else is going to eat them. Now these top carnivores are really important because they help with the stability of the ecosystem. They help keep the lower levels in check. And we'll find out probably at the end of the next video about keystone species. Top carnivores are often keystone species that have a wider impact on their environment than just eating from the level below them. We often think of energy flow within an ecosystem as a straight line. And energy is passed from the primary consumers the primary producers up through the consumers to the tertiary. And along the way, some of that energy is lost. And not all of it is passed to the next level. But when we think about these food chains, they're probably the most familiar to us. We learn about food chains in elementary school. But in a real environment, this energy flow is actually more of a web. Now, the reason is that this rodent is not only eating this patch of grass, he's eating this other plant over here and maybe a third one that's not listed. And that hawk is not only eating the snake, but it might also be eating the rodent that the snake would eat, and it might be eating another rodent. And then we have this second rodent in here that is affecting this plant over here, and so on. So really, we have all sorts of transfers of energy occurring within our environment. And energy might be passed directly from the primary consumer to the tertiary consumer, ignoring the second one. This top carnivore is probably not going to eat many plants, but it is possible that it might consume some plants as well. And so you can see this energy flows through the environment. Now, what happens to the energy in that top carnivore? Well, really, that energy in the top carnivore and any of these other organisms along the way can be broken down by decomposers. So we have decomposers and detritivores. So decomposers are organisms that break down other living or dead matter. Detritivores are going to eat dead matter or waste and break down the waste. Without decomposers and detritivores, the waste on the planet from all the dead organisms and all of the feces and things like that would just accumulate. So decomposers and detritivores are important in not only breaking down dead organisms, but getting that energy back into the food web, because without them, that energy is just lost. So if these detritivores and decomposers can break down that energy and release it back into the environment in some way, they're contributing to this energy cycle as well. They're also contributing to cycling the chemical components, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. So decomposers can be bacteria. They're very often fungi. Those are eukaryotic organisms. You guys are familiar with mold. Mold is a fungus that decomposes things. Decomposes food, decomposes leaf litter, decomposes dead organisms. Bacteria do the same thing. They break down dead organisms and release those chemicals and nutrients back into the environment. Detritivores are organisms that feed on that decomposing matter. So here we have a dung beetle. These guys are kind of gross and kind of weird. They run around collecting balls of feces, and that's their food. It's not my particular choice of food, but you know, neither is a decomposing orange. So what are you going to do? The important thing is that these guys are recyclers. They get that energy back. They get the chemical components back into the soil so that it can enter the food chain through the plants again. As energy is transferred up through the food chain or through the food web, some energy is lost. And if we look at a pyramid of how much energy is actually passed to the next level, we find that it's not very energy efficient. Only about 10% of all of the energy in one level of the food chain is going to be passed up to the next level. This limits the number of big carnivores, the number of top consumers. And it's the reason that we cannot get past a tertiary level, tertiary carnivore, because there's not enough energy available for that organism. Most of the energy is either spent in running the organism or it is lost as heat. And so there's very little energy that is left for the next level up. So if we look at this in terms of mass, rather than 10% of the energy, let's say that we have a weight, an organic weight of a particular individual. Only 10% of the weight is going to be transferred to the next level. To think of it another way, you have to eat 10 times of your weight in the energy level below you. So if you have a single cow that weighs 1,200 pounds, he has to eat about 12,000 pounds of grain just to reach its weight, because only 10% of the energy in that 12,000 pounds is available for that cow. So if the cow is going to become a 1,200 pound cow, it has to eat 10 times that amount of weight. And then if you think about who is going to eat that cow, only about 120 pounds of biomass is actually going to be available to be consumed by other organisms. And what I mean by that is that only 120 pounds worth of biomass is actually going to be added to the next level above it, because only 10% of the energy in the biomass is being transferred to the next level. So here's an easier to understand diagram. If we have our producers and they are absorbing sunlight, converting it into food energy, but also taking some of that into converting it into its structures and its own growth and metabolism. So only some of that, 10%, is actually available to the next generation. And then the next level, the next trophic level. And then 10% of that level, of our little rodent here, is available for the snake. And 10% of that is available for the hawk. And so you see that we're losing a huge chunk of energy. So that means that this tertiary consumer has to eat a lot of snakes, or if we're looking at our food web on the previous slide, has to eat a lot of other rodents. This herbivore has to eat a lot of plants. And so as we're losing this energy, these trophic levels require more and more energy to sustain a single individual. And this is why we have a limited number of tertiary consumers. It's also why we have a limited number of really large animals, because they have to eat so much energy from the levels below them. At the start of the video, I talked about the primary producers affecting all the other trophic levels. Now, if you have a large number of primary producers that can produce a large amount of energy, you can support a larger biomass of top consumers. So this is common in regions like the rainforest, where you have a lot of sunlight, you have a lot of vegetation that can be supported, and therefore you have a lot of consumers that can take energy from the producer level and pass it up the energy pyramid. If you have a small base pyramid, this means that you have very little energy in those primary producers, and so you can support even less consumers. Now, this is common in places with limited plant life, like a desert or an open ocean. Now, in some weird cases, you get this inverted pyramid. Now, if we're looking at this in terms of biomass instead of energy, when we think about the open ocean, Most of the energy source actually comes from plankton, which is microscopic. You can't see it, but is the main food source for a lot of organisms within the ocean. Their particular biomass at any given time is very small, but they contain enough energy that they can actually support what would seem to be a larger amount of consumers above them. So energy passes through an ecosystem. It enters at the producer level, it's passed up through the consumers. Most of it is lost as heat and used in metabolism. It's not recycled at the end, because even if those decomposers and detritivores break down the tertiary consumers, they're still not getting a lot of energy. The only way you can acquire new energy is to get it from producers. But the chemicals in an environment are actually cycled through the environment. They're passed from one organism to another. And it's just a continual reuse of those molecules. Now, they might be passed through living organism to living organism. Eventually, they're going to get into the soil and become part of the abiotic environment, the non-living part of the environment. And then they'll have to be taken up by plants again. But they're continuously cycled through. Most of these chemicals are contained in reservoirs that are non-living parts of the ecosystem. They're storage banks for these chemicals. And we're going to talk about the three main chemical cycles: carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And then I also threw in the water cycle in here because the water cycle is also important in our ecosystem. Before we go into the carbon cycle, though, I want to take a break and really quickly talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now, these are two really important chemical processes, and we skip them in Bio 100 because they're really detailed. You have to understand a lot of chemistry to really get into what is happening. But they are the foundation of all of the energy and a lot of the chemical transfer that happens within living organisms. So the process of photosynthesis is taking in light energy and carbon dioxide. There's our carbon source. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And incorporating it into the plant. Now, that light energy is converted into chemical energy in the form of sugar. So there we have the harnessing of our light energy along with carbon dioxide into a form of chemical energy that can be used as food energy for the next trophic level. The process of cellular respiration uses that sugar energy and is broken down in the mitochondria. Now, if you remember from chapter 4, I believe, we talked about the mitochondria and how it is the powerhouse of the cell. It is the organelle that breaks down chemical energy and uses it for work in the cell. So we have this light energy, this energy flow from the sun into plants, and then either into the plant's own mitochondria or into the mitochondria of other organisms that eat the plant. When the primary consumers eat the plant, they also take that energy from the plant, and their own cells can break down that energy. And then this diagram here, this is showing photosynthesis occurring in the chloroplasts, the production of sugar molecules, and then usage in the mitochondria to produce ATP, which is our energy molecule in the cell, and then it's released as heat energy. But along with that, we also have this cycle of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is the carbon source, the basis for most of the organic molecules on Earth. Carbon dioxide is going to enter the plant, and as a byproduct of this process of photosynthesis, oxygen is released. Now, we breathe in oxygen. We require it to live. Oxygen is required for the mitochondria to produce energy. So oxygen is a byproduct, not the goal, but a byproduct of photosynthesis. We use that byproduct to fuel the mitochondria and energy production. Now you might say, oh, but I need it to breathe. But the reason you need it to breathe is because you have to get it into the mitochondria. It's not just about breathing, it's about using it as part of your energy production. And then, of course, we release carbon dioxide. So as a byproduct of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide is released from those organisms that breathe, and then plants use it. So the carbon cycle. Most of the carbon that that is in our atmosphere is just already there. It is released by organisms that perform respiration. It is released in the breakdown of fossil fuels, whether that is natural or otherwise, and released into the atmosphere. But the majority of carbon dioxide is already present. Now, we need carbon dioxide because, well, we, meaning living organisms, need carbon dioxide because that is the molecule that plants are going to fix. Now, this process of taking carbon dioxide and turning it into something usable for the plant is called carbon fixation. Now, carbon fixation is important because that is what happens in plants that gets the sunlight energy that can be converted into chemical energy that is usable for all these other organisms. So the ultimate source of carbon dioxide is the atmosphere that's already present, and then plants take it in, convert it using sunlight energy into chemical energy in the form of sugars, some other organic molecules. Then plants release carbon dioxide when they perform respiration. When plants die, they are decomposed and become part of the carbon reservoir within the earth. When they are decomposed and over time are turned into coal, oil, or natural gas. These living organisms that consume the plant and then consume one another are also transferring carbon through their cells. When they die, they get locked up by after decomposition into coal, oil, and other natural resources. But they also respire and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, let's pretend we don't have all of this on the right with the factories. This is the way things are supposed to go. Over time, this carbon would be released back into the environment as plants take it up as it's broken down, but that takes a really long time. We are increasing the speed of this process by burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas. Now, this is a problem because it releases a lot of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere that's supposed to be locked up in these reservoirs, in these carbon reservoirs. Now, along with this, we also produce greenhouse gases, which are other types of gases, methane and things like that, that are actually causing problems in addition to the increase in carbon dioxide. And this is what is going to lead to, or is leading to, global warming. And we'll come back to that in chapter 18. So we are not only breathing carbon dioxide because we're living and respiring, but as humans, we are also releasing other things back into the atmosphere, or other sources of carbon back into the atmosphere. So the nitrogen cycle is also really important. Now, nitrogen is important because the only way we get nitrogen into living organisms is through an intermediate step with bacteria. And we need nitrogen because every protein molecule on our planet has nitrogen as its foundation. Amino acids are made up in a large part of nitrogen. Now, there's a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere. Most of our atmosphere is actually nitrogen, but it's unusable. We cannot use it ourselves. We require the help of some friendly little bacteria. These bacteria can take atmospheric nitrogen and they can fix it or convert it into something that we can use. These nitrogen fixing bacteria are going to take atmospheric nitrogen and they're going to turn it into ammonia and other nitrogen containing compounds. Now, once they are in these bacteria, it can be further modified by other bacteria before it is taken up into plants. So not only are plants an important energy and carbon source, but they're also a really important nitrogen source. Now, once it transfers through all of these organisms and these organisms die, animal waste and plant waste is broken down by soil bacteria again and released as nitrogen. So here we see this cycle. When that nitrogen is released into the atmosphere, other bacteria, these nitrogen fixing bacteria, can again make ammonia and other compounds that is going to be usable. Now remember, this is important because the basis of all proteins is actually nitrogen. And we need proteins in order for all of our cellular processes and the majority of our structures to be produced. So our final chemical cycle is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is found in the soil. Now, phosphorus can again be taken up by plants. Phosphorus is absorbed into plant roots as phosphate. This is a phosphorus oxygen molecule. Phosphate is really important because it is required in DNA. Remember, our DNA is made up of a sugar and phosphate backbone, and it's also important in ATP, which is our energy currency. It's like our energy coins. And so both of these are required in order to produce our organic molecules and to produce our energy molecules. Again, these are transferred through the food web. When these organisms break down, soil bacteria break down that phosphate and return it to the soil environment where plants can take it back up. Another step, another important source of phosphorus is induced by rain. So rain causes weathering of rocks, which releases phosphorus from those rocks into the soil where it can enter this phosphorus cycle. So although not a chemical cycle per se, the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle, is really important as well because it influences our weather patterns. It influences the ability of plants to take up their nutrients from their roots. And so I wanted to put it in here. We could have just as easily put it in with the weather. Let's pick a point to start. Let's start with rain. So we learned how precipitation happens, how rain is formed in the first video, in our weather video. So rain comes down and the rainwater filters in through rocks and things and releases nutrients into soil as rocks are weathered and break down. This can also cause change in geography of a particular environment. Eventually, it will enter a lake, river, stream, ocean because of snowmelt, runoff, and further precipitation. Now, of course, animals that depend on an aquatic environment are grateful for water. Plants are going to uptake water through a process called evapotranspiration, transpiration. So what happens is then in the leaves of a plant, they have little tiny holes. Now those holes are open for gas exchange because remember, plants have to take in carbon dioxide. They have to release oxygen. So as those little pores are open, water also evaporates out. Now this causes a chain reaction. As one water molecule as one water molecule evaporates, it sort of tugs on the one below it because water likes to stick together. And it tugs all the way through the plant. So as one molecule evaporates, it tugs others with it. Now this leaves some quote-unquote space for new water to enter from the roots. So water is taken up through plants, through their roots as other water molecules evaporate off. Water also enters the atmosphere due to evaporation when the sunlight, or when the sun heats up water, when the environment heats up water, water molecules are released from the surface and evaporate. Remember, as air cools, the water molecules in it begin to condense, and when the air gets too heavy, too saturated with water, it comes back down as rain. Nitrogen and phosphorus are critically important for life on Earth, but sometimes too much is not a good thing. When farmers are plowing their land and they are adding fertilizers and other chemicals, and not just farmers, anybody that is adding fertilizer to their lawn and their land, are eventually going to cause an increase in nitrogen and phosphorus somewhere. Now, locally, it's important. You add fertilizer to your lawn, it makes a nice lush green lawn because plants need nitrogen and phosphorus. But if you get too much runoff from particular environments and too much accumulation of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, say it's a large lake or even a small pond, this causes the algae and the bacteria to go crazy. Basically, they're getting all the nutrients they need and they are growing exponentially. When this happens, those organisms, the algae or the bacteria, cause something called eutrophication. So eutrophication is when you get a bloom in algae or bacteria in a short amount of time because of things like fertilizer runoff, large deposits of nitrogen or phosphorus into a particular aquatic ecosystem. When this happens, those algae or bacteria consume large amounts of oxygen really fast, decreasing the amount of oxygen available in that water. Now, this causes problems because all the other organisms in that water need the oxygen. And so when they consume this nitrogen and phosphorus and grow like crazy, they also consume oxygen, which limits the number of individuals that that pond can support, because if there's not enough oxygen, the animals that live in it are going to die. And so you can have huge die-offs due to eutrophication, due to this runoff, this increased nutrients in a particular aquatic ecosystem.